Blood trickles down Amara's face as the barrel of the gun presses harder against her temple. The neighborhood watch captain smirks, unaware of who she really is. "You people don't belong here," he whispers. Her fingers inch toward her badge. Everything changes tonight. Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see how this brave sheriff turns the tables on those who tried to drive her out of her own neighborhood. The tension is just beginning. The warm Georgia sun beat down on Amara Washington's shoulders as she stood on the front lawn of her new home, taking in the pristine streets of Oakwood Heights with a mixture of pride and apprehension. At 38 years old, she had just made history as the first female black sheriff of Clayton County, an achievement that still felt surreal even weeks after her swearing-in ceremony. Her husband Marcus, a successful architect whose innovative designs had recently caught the attention of several major development companies, wrapped his arm around her waist and squeezed gently. "We did it, babe," he whispered, his voice catching slightly as they gazed at the sprawling colonial-style house with its manicured lawn and brick facade. This was their dream home, purchased after years of saving and climbing their respective career ladders, a symbol of everything they had worked for. The exclusive gated community of Oakwood Heights represented success, safety, and stability, though Amara couldn't help but notice they appeared to be the only black family on the block. Their realtor, a nervous woman named Diane who smiled too widely and spoke too quickly, had pulled Marcus aside during the final walkthrough. "Just so you know," she had said in a hushed tone that Amara nevertheless overheard, "Oakwood Heights has, particular community standards. Very particular. The Homeowners Association is quite involved." Marcus had simply nodded and thanked her for the information, later dismissing Amara's concerns with his characteristic optimism. "It's 2025, babe. Things have changed. We've earned our place here just like everyone else." Yet as the moving truck rumbled up the driveway and the movers began unloading their furniture, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Curtains twitched in neighboring windows, and one older man across the street made no attempt to hide his scrutiny, openly taking photos of the moving truck with his phone. Amara had deliberately chosen not to mention her profession to any of their new neighbors during the purchasing process. After years in law enforcement, she had learned the value of keeping a separation between her work and home life, especially now that she held such a visible position. "It'll be nice to just be Amara and Marcus here, not Sheriff Washington," she had told Marcus, who agreed it might be simpler that way. As they directed the movers where to place their furniture, Amara overheard snippets of conversation from the street where two women power walking in matching athleisure outfits slowed their pace to stare. "I heard he's some big-shot architect," one said to the other, not bothering to lower her voice. "Got that new contract for the downtown development." The other woman nodded, glancing at Marcus. "Well, that explains how they afford this neighborhood. At least he has a real job." Amara bit her tongue, reminding herself that what these strangers thought didn't matter. Later that afternoon, as they were arranging books on the built-in shelves in their new living room, Marcus's phone rang incessantly with congratulatory calls about his recent promotion. Each time he answered with his professional voice, explaining the exciting new projects he'd be leading, Amara noticed more neighbors finding reasons to walk past their house, curiosity barely disguised as casual strolls. The doorbell rang just as they were unpacking their kitchen items, and Amara opened the door to find an elderly white woman with carefully styled silver hair holding a plate of cookies. "Welcome to Oakwood Heights," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Elaine Abernathy from 3 doors down. Thought you might like something sweet after all that moving." Amara accepted the plate with genuine gratitude, inviting Mrs. Abernathy in for tea. As they sat in their half-furnished living room, the older woman made conversation that gradually revealed her underlying assumptions. "You're both so articulate," she commented at one point, looking surprised. "And your husband, with his architecture firm, how wonderful that he's doing so well. It must make you very proud." Amara simply smiled and thanked her, not mentioning her own career accomplishments. When Mrs. Abernathy left, promising to introduce them to the right sort of people in the neighborhood, Amara and Marcus exchanged knowing looks but said nothing. The following morning, Amara found an envelope in their mailbox containing a printout of what appeared to be HOA guidelines, though there was no letterhead or official marking. Just checking if you received the HOA guidelines, read a handwritten note attached to the front. She flipped through the pages, frowning at several highlighted sections regarding maintaining neighborhood aesthetic standards and appropriate property maintenance. Marcus shrugged it off as a well-intentioned if somewhat pushy welcome gesture. 3 days after moving in, they woke to find all 4 tires of Amara's personal car flat in the driveway. Tucked under the windshield wiper was a printed notice that read, "Vehicles in disrepair violate HOA regulations, section 4.3. Please remedy within 24 hours to avoid further action." Amara examined the tires carefully, her law enforcement training immediately recognizing that they had been deliberately deflated rather than suffering any accidental damage. She locked eyes with Marcus across the car, his expression darkening as he realized what she had already concluded. This was no accident, and they were not as welcome in Oakwood Heights as they had hoped to be. Marcus insisted on reporting the tire incident to the local police, despite Amara's reluctance and her assertion that she could handle it through her own department. The responding officer, a young white man who barely looked at their identification, jotted down a few cursory notes before suggesting it was probably just neighborhood kids, and that they shouldn't worry too much about it. "We get these calls from Oakwood Heights sometimes," he said with a dismissive shrug. "New neighbors and all that. You know how it is." Amara knew exactly how it was, but Marcus placed a warning hand on her arm, silently asking her not to reveal her position. He was determined to handle things peacefully, to fit in rather than make waves. "We just want to be good neighbors," Marcus explained later that evening as they sat on their back porch, finally taking a moment to relax after days of unpacking. "If we come in throwing your weight around as sheriff, we'll never be accepted here. Let's give it time. Show them we're just a normal family who wants the same things they do." Amara reluctantly agreed, though her instincts were screaming that something more sinister than typical new neighbor curiosity was at play. Her suspicions were confirmed the following week when a man in khakis and a polo shirt bearing an unofficial-looking Oakwood Heights security logo knocked on their door. He introduced himself as Charles Whitfield, the HOA compliance officer, though his manner held none of the professional courtesy Amara would expect from someone in an official capacity. "Just doing my rounds," he explained with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We've had a few complaints about your property already." He handed Marcus a violation notice citing unapproved landscape modifications, despite the fact they hadn't changed anything about the yard since moving in. Before Marcus could protest, Charles was already walking away, calling over his shoulder, "You have 72 hours to remedy the situation before fines are assessed." That evening, Amara spent hours researching the Oakwood Heights HOA, discovering that while there was indeed a homeowners association, many of the guidelines being cited by Charles weren't part of the official bylaws filed with the county. She printed out the actual regulations, highlighting the discrepancies between what they were being told and what was legally enforceable. Her concentration was broken by Marcus calling her to the front yard, where she found him staring in disbelief at brown patches scattered across their previously perfect lawn. The damage appeared deliberate, with what looked like chemical burns in distinct patterns. Before they could even discuss what to do, Charles appeared as if he'd been waiting nearby, slipping another violation notice into Marcus's hand. "Lawn maintenance violations," he said with faux regret. "That's going to be a $100 fine, but we can waive it if the issue is fixed within 48 hours. Marcus attended the monthly HOA meeting that weekend while Amara was working, hoping to introduce himself properly and clear up the misunderstandings. When he returned, his expression was grim. "It was all coded language," he told Amara, pacing their living room. "They spent 20 minutes discussing maintaining neighborhood standards and preserving property values while staring at me like I was contaminating the room just by being there." At work, Amara casually mentioned their new home to Detective Luis Rivera, one of her most trusted officers and a longtime friend. His reaction was immediate concern. Oakwood Heights? Amara, that place has a reputation. My cousin's friend, Black Doctor, bought there in 2023. 3 months of harassment later, they sold at a loss just to get out. Rivera pulled up some files on his computer, showing Amara unofficial complaints that had never been formally investigated. Nothing ever sticks because the victims leave and don't want to pursue it, but the pattern's there if you know to look for it. Disturbed but not surprised, Amara installed security cameras around their property that evening, making sure they were discreet but comprehensive in their coverage. It didn't take long for them to capture Charles Whitfield prowling around their property at 2 a.m., shining a flashlight into windows and examining their cars. When Marcus saw the footage, his optimism finally cracked. Who does this guy think he is? Some kind of neighborhood cop? The next day, Marcus confronted Charles as he was placing yet another violation notice on their door, this time for unauthorized security cameras. Charles's friendly facade slipped momentarily, revealing a harder edge beneath. "I'm just doing my job," he said, straightening his polo shirt with the unofficial logo. "Maybe you folks would be more comfortable somewhere else. Oakwood Heights has certain standards that some people find challenging to maintain." Before Marcus could respond, Charles added in a lower voice, "We take neighborhood security very seriously here. Very seriously indeed." The implied threat hung in the air between them. That night, Amara went to check her service weapon in their home safe, a routine she had maintained throughout her law enforcement career. She immediately noticed that while nothing was missing, her badge and gun had been moved from their usual positions. Someone had opened the safe, examined the contents, and attempted to replace everything exactly as they'd found it. But Amara's meticulous nature and training meant she noticed the difference instantly. She called Marcus into the room, her voice tight with controlled anger. "This isn't about HOA rules anymore," she said quietly. "They've been inside our home." Marcus stared at the safe in disbelief, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. "What do we do now?" he asked, the fear in his voice unmistakable. Amara closed the safe with a decisive click. "No," she said. "Sheriff Washington goes to work." Have you ever had that moment when something shifts inside you, when you realize the rules you thought existed don't apply, and you need to create new ones? That's exactly what happened to Amara as she activated her sheriff mode while maintaining her cover as just another homeowner. While Marcus went to work each day, Amara began her covert investigation into Charles Whitfield and his unofficial neighborhood watch. Using her department's resources without drawing attention to her personal connection, she compiled information on the history of Oakwood Heights and its pattern of demographic stability. The results confirmed her worst suspicions. In the past 5 years, 5 minority families had purchased homes in the prestigious neighborhood, and all 5 had moved out within months. Property records showed they'd sold at losses ranging from 15 to 27% below market value, desperate to escape what one former resident had vaguely described as an unwelcoming atmosphere. In a real estate review, Amara created a secure file on her personal laptop, documenting every interaction, every fake violation notice, and every suspicious incident. At the sheriff's department, she found herself handling a case of police impersonation in a neighboring community that struck uncomfortably close to home. A group of men had been stopping Hispanic drivers in a predominantly white area, claiming to be community safety officers, with authority to check identification. The parallels to what was happening in her own neighborhood were impossible to ignore. When she returned home that evening, Marcus met her at the door with disturbing news. "Someone's been through our mail," he said, leading her to his home office. "The loan documents for my new studio space are missing. The bank says they delivered them 3 days ago, but the envelope was opened and resealed." Amara examined the torn edge of the envelope, anger building as she realized how deeply the harassment had penetrated their lives. Using her department database access, Amara discreetly researched Charles Whitfield's background. She discovered he had no official position with any legitimate homeowners association. The real Oakwood Heights HOA was headed by Victoria Stevenson, a name Amara had seen on community correspondence but never connected to any of the harassment they'd experienced. Making a calculated decision, Amara arranged a seemingly chance meeting with Victoria at the community mailboxes, carefully steering the conversation toward neighborhood management. Victoria seemed genuinely surprised when Amara mentioned Charles's title of compliance officer, stating that while Charles was certainly involved in community affairs, he held no official HOA position. "He's just very passionate about keeping Oakwood Heights special," Victoria explained with a tight smile. "The neighborhood watches his initiative, not officially affiliated with the HOA." This confirmation of Charles's self-appointed authority reinforced Amara's suspicions. Through careful observation and background checks, Amara identified 3 core members of Charles's security team: Richard Tanner, a retired police officer who had left the force under murky circumstances involving excessive force complaints; Stephen Wells, owner of a local insurance agency with political aspirations; and James Covington, former military who now ran a private security company that employed primarily former law enforcement officers with questionable records. Their security footage revealed these men conducting regular patrols of the neighborhood in personal vehicles equipped with unofficial-looking light bars and magnetic door signs reading, "Oakwood Heights Security." They seemed to focus particular attention on Amara and Marcus's home, driving by multiple times per day and occasionally parking across the street for extended periods. The harassment began extending beyond their home life when Marcus received a call from his largest client, abruptly canceling a contract worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. They mentioned concerns about reliability had been raised, Marcus told Amara, confusion and hurt evident in his voice. "I've never missed a deadline in my career. Someone's been talking to them." That evening, as Amara reviewed security footage, she noticed Charles approaching their mailbox wearing gloves despite the warm weather. She zoomed in on the camera feed, watching as he carefully placed something inside before walking away with practiced casualness. If you've ever been targeted simply because of who you are, put the number 1 in the comments right now. If you believe no one should be driven from their home because of their race, hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of justice being served. What would you do if you discovered someone had invaded your personal space, violated your mail, and threatened your livelihood? Would you run, or would you stand your ground? As Amara watches Charles tampering with her mail, she's about to make a decision that will change everything for Oakwood Heights. Let's see what happens next. The following morning, Amara retrieved the envelope Charles had placed in their mailbox, carefully handling it by the edges to preserve any fingerprint evidence. Inside was a typewritten letter filled with racial slurs and explicit threats, warning that mistakes, like selling to your kind, would be corrected one way or another. She photographed the letter in place before using tweezers to place it in an evidence bag, her law enforcement training taking over despite the personal nature of the threat. The escalation continued when Marcus received an official-looking notification that his business license was under investigation for fraud, followed by a call from their mortgage company about reports they had missed payments despite their spotless record and automatic withdrawals. "They're trying to destroy our credit and Marcus's business," Amara realized, the coordinated nature of the attacks becoming clear. "This goes beyond petty harassment." At the sheriff's department, Amara made a calculated decision, bringing Deputy Jamal Watson, a young black officer she trusted implicitly, into her confidence. "I need to open an official investigation, but it has to stay completely confidential," she explained, showing him the evidence she'd gathered. "If word gets back to these guys that the sheriff is onto them, they'll either scatter or escalate dangerously." Deputy Watson examined the documentation with growing anger. "They've been getting away with this for years, haven't they?" he asked, leafing through the pattern of minority families driven from the neighborhood. Amara nodded grimly. "And they'd perfected their system. Nothing overly illegal enough to trigger immediate action, just constant pressure until people give up and leave." Together, they began building official case files, conducting background checks that revealed Charles Whitfield had applied to 3 different police academies over the years, rejected each time during psychological evaluation phases. His history included numerous complaints filed against minority business owners and neighbors in previous communities where he'd lived, none resulting in action but establishing a clear pattern of targeting people of color. "He's playing cop because they wouldn't let him be one," Deputy Watson observed. "And he's surrounded himself with people who enable his power trip." To gather more intelligence without arousing suspicion, Amara and Marcus attended a neighborhood barbecue hosted by one of Charles's associates. Though they were largely ignored by most residents, they strategically positioned themselves to overhear conversations, learning of an emergency HOA meeting planned for the following week to address security concerns in the community. As they were preparing to leave the gathering, James Covington approached Marcus in the parking lot, aggressively confronting him about supposed code violations they had documented. "We've been watching your house," he said, alcohol making him more forthright than usual. "Charles says you people need extra attention to understand how things work here." Marcus remained calm, aware that Amara was recording the interaction with her phone discreetly in her pocket. That night, they installed additional hidden cameras and microphones around their property, focusing on areas Charles and his team had shown particular interest in. "We need irrefutable evidence," Amara explained as she positioned a tiny camera inside a decorative bird feeder with a view of their driveway. "The kind that will hold up in court and can't be explained away." Their preparations proved prescient when, 2 days later, a vehicle with a magnetic security sign and mounted light bar attempted to pull Amara over as she drove home from the grocery store. Richard Tanner, the former police officer, approached her window with all the authority of an actual law enforcement officer, unaware of who he was truly confronting. "License and registration," he demanded without identifying himself or providing any legitimate reason for the stop. Amara calmly complied while activating the recording app on her phone. "Can I ask what department you're with?" she inquired innocently. Tanner puffed up importantly. "Oakwood Heights Security. We have authorization to conduct traffic stops within community boundaries." When Amara politely requested to see his law enforcement credentials, his demeanor shifted from authoritative to threatening. "You don't get to ask questions here," he snapped. "Just compliance. Consider this your first warning." As soon as she returned home, Amara added the recording to her growing evidence file and contacted an FBI agent she had worked with on civil rights cases in the past, describing the situation without revealing her personal involvement. "This sounds like a potential violation of federal housing law," the agent confirmed. "If they're systematically driving out minority homeowners, that's textbook housing discrimination. Keep gathering evidence, and we'll open a preliminary file." Working late into the night, Amara compiled testimonials from former residents she had tracked down, most of whom had been reluctant to speak until they understood an official investigation was underway. Their stories followed a disturbing pattern: initial small harassments escalating to property damage, threats, and eventually economic pressure through interfering with their employment or finances. The following morning, an official-looking envelope was hand-delivered to their door. Inside was a formal, final warning, on counterfeit Oakwood Heights letterhead, stating that enforcement action would be taken by the Oakwood Heights Security Committee if they didn't remedy their ongoing violations and disruptive presence in the community. The letter was signed by Charles Whitfield with the self-appointed title, Head of Community Enforcement. Amara held the letter up to the light, examining the watermark and printing quality. "They've gone to a lot of trouble to make this look official," she commented to Marcus. "Most people would be intimidated enough to comply or leave." Marcus took the letter, reading it with a frown. "What's their next move? They've done everything short of physical violence." Amara's expression hardened as she recalled similar cases she'd investigated throughout her career. "That's usually what comes next," she said quietly. "They escalate until they get what they want. But they've never targeted someone who fights back like I can." She checked her hidden cameras, ensuring everything was recording properly. "The trap is set. Now we wait for them to make their move." Amara and Marcus woke Sunday morning to find their front door vandalized with spray-painted racial slurs, the red paint still tacky in the early morning light. Marcus immediately called the local police, but the responding officers took minimal notes and suggested it was likely just teenage pranks, despite the clearly targeted nature of the vandalism. Insufficient evidence to classify as a hate crime, one officer concluded after a cursory examination that lasted less than 5 minutes. No witnesses, no camera footage from this angle. Amara bit her tongue, knowing her hidden cameras had indeed captured 3 figures approaching their house around 2 in the morning, though the night vision hadn't clearly identified faces. She added the footage to her growing evidence file without revealing its existence to the dismissive local officers. After the police left, Marcus helped her clean the door, his movements mechanical as the reality of their situation fully sank in. "I've been designing spaces my whole career to make people feel safe, welcomed, at home," he said, his voice hollow as he scrubbed at the hateful words. "And now—" Amara squeezed his shoulder, her resolve hardening. The personal attack had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. In the days that followed, Charles and his self-appointed security team became more brazen, openly following Amara and Marcus whenever they left home. A vehicle would appear behind them almost immediately after they pulled out of their driveway, following at a conspicuous distance. When they walked the neighborhood, a member of Charles's team would appear, ostensibly checking lawns or mailboxes, but always keeping them in sight. "They want us to know we're being watched," Marcus observed as Stephen Wells pretended to inspect a fire hydrant across from the community park where they were having a picnic. "They're trying to make us feel unwelcome in every corner of this neighborhood." At the sheriff's department, Amara's discreet investigation uncovered disturbing connections between the Oakwood Heights developers and local officials who had repeatedly dismissed complaints from previous minority residents. Campaign contribution records showed substantial donations from the development company to the mayor and 2 council members who oversaw housing regulations. Building permits had been expedited, zoning exceptions granted, all while complaints about discriminatory practices were buried in bureaucratic red tape. The pattern suggested corruption reaching into the local government, explaining why previous attempts to address the discrimination had failed. When Amara returned home that evening, Marcus met her with new concerns. "My firm just lost the West Side development contract," he said, showing her an email citing community feedback about reliability issues. "That's the 3rd major project we've lost in a month. Someone's been contacting my clients, Amara. We can't take much more of this financially." For the first time since the harassment began, Marcus suggested they consider moving. "We can find another house, somewhere we're actually welcome. Is this fight worth destroying everything we've built?" Amara understood his frustration, but the law enforcement officer in her refused to be intimidated. "If we leave, they win. Again. And they'll do it to the next family that doesn't fit their preferred demographic. This stops with us." That night, their security cameras captured Charles meeting with his core team in the community center parking lot. With the audio enhancement software Amara had installed, they could make out phrases like, "make an example," and send a message at the meeting. Charles seemed to be coordinating something for the upcoming community gathering, his gestures becoming more animated as he outlined his plan to the others. Recognizing the potential for dangerous escalation, Amara made secure calls to trusted colleagues in neighboring counties, arranging for plainclothes officers to be strategically positioned when needed. "No official capacity yet," she explained to her counterpart in Fulton County. "Just be ready to move when I give the signal. This needs to be handled carefully to ensure the evidence is admissible." The following afternoon, Mrs. Abernathy knocked on their door, looking nervously over her shoulder before speaking in a hushed tone. "I thought you should know," she said, wringing her hands. "Charles has been telling people you're drug dealers. That's why you can afford this house, he says. He's showing people photos of your comings and goings, claiming you're making deliveries." The elderly woman looked genuinely distressed. "I don't believe it for a minute, but others might. Some people will believe anything that confirms what they want to think." After thanking Mrs. Abernathy for the warning, Amara made a disturbing discovery while reviewing department scheduling records. Her work calendar, including days off and patrol routes, had somehow been accessed and potentially leaked. Someone inside her own department was feeding information to Charles's group. The betrayal cut deep, but also provided an opportunity to identify the mole. Amara deliberately entered false schedule information into the system, then watched to see if Charles's surveillance patterns changed in response. Later that week, an official-looking notice appeared on every door in the neighborhood, announcing a mandatory community meeting to address criminal elements that had infiltrated our exclusive community. The letter heavily implied that Amara and Marcus were these elements, without naming them directly. "It's a setup," Amara told Marcus as they read the notice together. "They're planning to publicly accuse us, turn the whole neighborhood against us at once." Marcus looked at the signature at the bottom of the page, Charles Whitfield's name followed by Head of Community Enforcement, in bold lettering. "He's really committed to this fantasy of being some kind of authority figure, isn't he?" Amara nodded grimly, checking her service weapon before securing it in its holster. Men like Charles are dangerous precisely because they believe they have authority they don't actually possess. They create their own reality and enforce it however they see fit. She pulled out a stack of folders from her briefcase, each labeled with the name of a member of Charles's group, containing detailed evidence of their activities. "But reality is about to catch up with them," she added, her voice steady with determination. "And they have no idea what's coming." Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt every eye turned toward you, silent judgment hanging in the air like a toxic cloud? That's exactly what happened when Amara and Marcus arrived at the Oakwood Heights Community Center for the mandatory meeting. The large room was packed, rows of chairs filled with residents whose conversations died as the couple entered. Charles Whitfield stood at the front, flanked by his unofficial security team, all wearing matching polo shirts with the fake Oakwood Heights Security logo. A projector screen behind them displayed the community logo and the ominous title, Addressing Community Threats. Amara scanned the room quickly, noting the exits, identifying the faces she recognized from her investigation, and spotting Deputy Watson in plainclothes at the back of the room, pretending to be a resident's guest. Several other officers she trusted were similarly positioned, unrecognizable to anyone who didn't know to look for them. Charles tapped the microphone as Amara and Marcus took seats in the middle of the room, deliberately placing themselves where they would be surrounded by other residents. "Thank you all for coming to this emergency security meeting," Charles began, his voice carrying an authority he had no right to claim. "As many of you know, Oakwood Heights has maintained certain standards that have kept our community safe and our property values high for over 20 years. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience as Charles launched into a presentation filled with coded language about neighborhood character and declining standards in nearby communities that had failed to maintain appropriate oversight. He displayed charts showing property values in neighboring areas that had allowed unrestricted demographic changes, the racism thinly veiled behind economic concerns. Victoria Stevenson, the actual HOA president, sat in the front row looking increasingly uncomfortable as Charles's rhetoric became more explicit. When he announced new security measures, including increased patrols, mandatory identification checks for suspicious individuals, and a community reporting system for unusual activities, she shifted in her seat, glancing toward the exit. "We've recently identified specific concerns within our own community," Charles continued, his gaze fixing directly on Amara and Marcus. "Elements that don't align with our established community values and may pose risks to our safety and property values." Amara raised her hand, her expression neutral despite the rage building inside her. When Charles reluctantly acknowledged her, she spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I'm curious about the legal authority for these measures. As homeowners who reviewed the official HOA bylaws, we don't see provisions for private security forces or mandatory identification checks." A tense silence followed her question. Charles's face tightened as he replied, The Oakwood Heights Security Committee has broad authority to implement measures necessary for community safety. That authority supersedes the basic HOA guidelines in emergency situations. And who grants this authority? Amara pressed, knowing full well no such authority existed. Before Charles could fabricate an answer, Richard Tanner stepped forward. We don't need to explain ourselves to people who don't belong here, he snapped, several residents gasping at the naked hostility in his voice. Charles quickly regained control, placing a restraining hand on Tanner's arm. What my colleague means is that these security protocols were established long before you arrived. All residents implicitly agreed to them upon purchasing property here. As Charles spoke, Stephen Wells began distributing handouts showing photographs of suspicious activities in the neighborhood. When the papers reached Amara and Marcus, they saw their own house featured prominently, with circled timestamps of their comings and goings, and annotations suggesting these were evidence of possible illegal activities. Charles dimmed the lights and projected similar images on the screen, now openly accusing them. We have documented unusual patterns of behavior, frequent visitors at odd hours, and unexplained financial resources inconsistent with reported employment. Members of the security team positioned themselves near the exits as residents began turning to stare at Amara and Marcus with growing hostility. When Marcus stood to defend them, Richard Tanner immediately approached, physically pushing him back into his seat with a hand on his shoulder. Stay seated during the presentation, he growled, his grip tightening painfully. Amara rose to protest this manhandling of her husband, her voice cutting through the murmurs. You have no right to touch him. You have no authority here whatsoever. The room fell silent as Charles pulled something from behind the podium, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Actually, we have the authority of concerned citizens protecting their community, he said, walking toward Amara. And under citizens' arrest provisions, we have the right to detain individuals engaged in criminal activity until proper authorities arrive. With a dramatic flourish, Charles pulled out a handgun, pointing it directly at Amara. I am placing you under citizen's arrest on suspicion of drug trafficking and conspiracy to reduce property values through organized criminal activity. Complete silence fell over the room as residents recoiled in shock. Some stood to leave but found the exits blocked by Charles's men. Everyone stays until this is resolved, Charles announced, his gun still trained on Amara. We've contacted the real police to take them into custody. Amara's hand moved slowly toward the inside of her jacket, causing Charles to step closer, pressing the barrel against her temple. Don't even think about pulling a weapon, he hissed, close enough now that only she could hear his next words. We know exactly what you are, and you don't belong here. If you believe what Charles is doing is absolutely wrong and criminal, comment number 1 right now. If you think Amara should reveal her true identity, hit that like button and subscribe to see what happens next. What would you do in this terrifying situation? Would you play along or stand your ground? As the gun presses against Amara's temple and her fingers continue moving toward her jacket, the entire room is about to witness something they never expected. Complete silence fell over the community center as Amara's fingers slowly withdrew from her jacket. Not with a weapon as Charles clearly expected, but with her sheriff's badge, the gold gleaming under the fluorescent lights as she held it up for everyone to see. The collective gasp from the assembled residents was audible, followed by confused murmurs as they processed what they were seeing. Charles froze, his gun still pressed against her temple, his eyes widening in shock and disbelief. That's a fake, he stammered, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. A prop to throw us off. Amara remained perfectly calm, her years of law enforcement training evident in her steady voice and controlled breathing despite the deadly weapon against her head. I am Sheriff Amara Washington of Clayton County, she announced clearly, each word precise and carrying to every corner of the now silent room. And you, Charles Whitfield, are currently committing multiple felonies, including impersonating law enforcement, false imprisonment, assault with a deadly weapon, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to violate federal housing laws. Charles's hand trembled slightly, the gun barrel wavering against her skin as the full implications of his situation began to dawn on him. You're lying, he insisted, though with noticeably less conviction. This is some kind of trick. Amara continued as if he hadn't spoken, her voice remaining steady and authoritative. Every person in this room should be aware that I am not the only law enforcement officer present. She methodically identified each member of her undercover team by pointing them out. Deputy Watson by the back door. Detective Rivera near the refreshment table. Lieutenant Chin beside the emergency exit. Sergeant Rodriguez in the third row. Each officer stood as she named them, badges appearing in their hands. Charles's security team looked frantically between each other, their carefully constructed power dynamic crumbling before their eyes. The door at the rear of the community center opened, and Deputy Watson admitted several uniformed officers who quickly took up positions around the room, their presence eliminating any possibility of Charles or his associates attempting to flee. Your so-called security team has been under investigation for weeks, Amara continued, still not moving despite the gun at her temple. Every fake violation notice, every act of vandalism, every threatening letter, every illegal traffic stop has been documented, photographed, and added to a case file that now sits with both my department and the FBI Civil Rights Division. Victoria Stevenson and several other residents physically distanced themselves from Charles, moving their chairs away as the reality of the situation became clear. The HOA president's face had drained of color as she realized her potential liability in enabling Charles's reign of terror, even if only through inaction. Charles pressed the gun harder against Amara's temple, causing a trickle of blood to run down her face where the sight cut into her skin. His composure was rapidly disintegrating as he realized the trap he had walked into. "Everyone stay back!" he shouted, desperation evident in his voice. "I still have the upper hand here. She's making this up. They're trying to destroy our community." Amara remained unfazed, continuing her methodical dismantling of his authority. "My body camera has been recording this entire meeting," she informed him and the shocked audience. "It's streaming directly to the sheriff's department servers. Even if you pull that trigger, Charles, the evidence doesn't disappear. You've already lost." From the back of the room, a new voice spoke up. "I'm Special Agent Michaels with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," announced a tall woman in a business suit who had been quietly observing the proceedings. "We've been conducting a parallel investigation into housing discrimination and civil rights violations in Oakwood Heights for the past 6 months." She held up her credentials for all to see. "What we've witnessed tonight will be added to an already substantial federal case." Charles's face contorted with rage and panic, his worldview collapsing around him. "This is my neighborhood!" he screamed, spittle flying from his lips as his facade of professional authority completely crumbled. "I've protected it for 20 years. You people don't get to come in here and change the rules." He grabbed Amara roughly, pulling her in front of him as a human shield, the gun now pressed under her chin. "Everyone back off, or the sheriff gets a bullet right here," he threatened, beginning to edge toward the nearest exit. "I'm walking out of here, and she's coming with me until I'm safe." What Charles failed to notice in his panic was Marcus quietly circling behind him, moving between chairs as attention remained focused on the standoff. With the timing and precision that came from his architectural training, Marcus calculated distances and angles, waiting for the perfect moment to act. When Charles's attention shifted briefly toward Deputy Watson, who had taken a step forward, Marcus launched himself at the gunman, tackling him from behind with enough force to separate him from Amara and send the gun skittering across the floor. Charles hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs as Marcus pinned him down. Within seconds, deputies swarmed them, securing Charles in handcuffs while ensuring Marcus was unharmed. Around the room, similar scenes played out as the rest of Charles's security team was simultaneously taken into custody, their resistance minimal once they realized the extent of the operation against them. Richard Tanner attempted to flee but was quickly apprehended by Lieutenant Chin. Stephen Wells immediately began claiming he had no idea what Charles had been doing, while James Covington stood stone-faced as he was read his rights. As Charles was hauled to his feet, blood from a cut on his forehead where he'd struck the floor dripping down his face, he locked eyes with Amara one final time. "You've ruined everything," he spat, struggling against his restraints. Amara calmly wiped the blood from her own temple where his gun had cut her. "No, Charles. You did that yourself the moment you decided some people don't deserve to live where they choose based on the color of their skin." She turned to address the stunned residents still seated in the community center, many recording the scene on their phones while others sat in shocked silence. For years, this neighborhood has been controlled through fear and intimidation. She told them, her voice carrying the weight of both professional authority and personal experience. "Those of you who knew what was happening and said nothing are complicit. Those who actively participated will face charges. And those who were also victimized but afraid to speak up, you can come forward now. This ends tonight." As Charles and his associates were led out to waiting patrol cars, the magnitude of what had just occurred began to sink in for the residents of Oakwood Heights. Their exclusive community had just been exposed as the site of a criminal conspiracy, and nothing would ever be the same again. The story exploded across local media within hours of the arrests, making the front page of every newspaper and leading every broadcast in the metropolitan area. "Sheriff goes undercover in own neighborhood to expose housing discrimination ring," became the headline that captured national attention by the following morning, with major networks picking up the story and sending reporters to camp outside the gates of Oakwood Heights. Amara found herself at the center of a media storm, her phone ringing constantly with interview requests, and her email filling with messages from journalists seeking exclusive details. The body camera footage of Charles pointing a gun at her head while she revealed her badge became the defining image of the case, replayed on news broadcasts alongside her calm, methodical dismantling of his false authority. The sheriff's department held a press conference where Amara, still sporting the small cut on her temple, laid out the preliminary findings of her investigation. This was not simply a case of neighborhood tension or overzealous HOA enforcement, she explained to the assembled reporters. "Our evidence reveals a systematic, years-long effort to intimidate minority homeowners and drive them from the community through escalating harassment, property damage, economic sabotage, and ultimately physical threats." She presented a timeline showing the 5 previous minority families who had been forced out of Oakwood Heights, complete with documentation of similar patterns of harassment in each case. "What makes this case particularly disturbing is the coordination between multiple parties and the deliberate manipulation of quasi-official authority to create the illusion of legitimacy," she continued. "The suspects created counterfeit documents, impersonated officials, and established an elaborate framework of fake rules and regulations designed to appear official to their victims. The FBI simultaneously announced its own investigation into potential civil rights violations and conspiracy charges. Special Agent Michaels confirmed that federal authorities had been monitoring similar patterns in exclusive communities across the state, suggesting the problem extended far beyond Oakwood Heights. "We have reason to believe this may be part of a broader network of housing discrimination that has gone undetected or unreported for years," she stated at a separate press briefing. Victoria Stevenson and other HOA board members found themselves under intense scrutiny as investigators sought to determine their level of knowledge and involvement in Charles's scheme. When confronted with evidence that they had received and ignored complaints from previous minority residents, several board members quickly turned on each other, each claiming ignorance while suggesting others had been aware of the discrimination. Victoria herself appeared genuinely shocked by the extent of Charles's activities, though her failure to investigate earlier complaints still placed her in legal jeopardy. "I thought he was just being overzealous about community standards," she claimed through her attorney. "I had no idea he was specifically targeting certain homeowners based on race." As news coverage continued, former victims began contacting Amara's office, emboldened by the arrests to finally speak publicly about their experiences. Dr. Elijah Johnson, a neurosurgeon who had sold his Oakwood Heights home at a 20% loss after 3 months of escalating harassment in 2023, provided detailed records of vandalism, threatening notes, and suspicious activity around his property that the local police had dismissed as insufficient evidence at the time. I knew what was happening was wrong, but I had no proof it was coordinated," he explained in a television interview. "When my children started finding threatening notes in their backpacks at school, we decided no house was worth their safety." His testimony, along with similar accounts from other former residents, strengthened the case against Charles and his associates, while highlighting the systemic failures that had allowed their activities to continue for so long. Marcus's professional reputation began to recover as the truth emerged about who had sabotaged his contracts. Several clients contacted him to apologize for believing the false information they had received about his firm's reliability, with 2 immediately offering to reinstate previously canceled projects. "Someone calling himself a community business liaison contacted us with concerns about your financial stability," one developer explained. "He provided what appeared to be documentation of liens against your property and pending lawsuits that would affect your ability to complete our project. We now know those documents were completely fabricated." At the sheriff's department, Amara faced mixed reactions from her colleagues. Many deputies praised her courage and commitment to justice, with Deputy Watson becoming something of a department celebrity for his role in the undercover operation. Others, however, kept their distance, uncomfortable with the spotlight now shining on practices they had previously ignored or dismissed. The internal investigation into who had leaked Amara's schedule to Charles quickly focused on Senior Deputy Frank Miller, a 20-year veteran with family connections to one of the original developers of Oakwood Heights. When confronted with evidence that he had accessed and shared Amara's confidential work information, Miller was placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation and potential criminal charges. "The betrayal by one of our own is perhaps the most disappointing aspect of this case," Amara acknowledged to her command staff. "But it also demonstrates why this type of discrimination persists. It relies on people in positions of authority looking the other way or actively enabling it." As the legal proceedings against Charles and his accomplices began, the broader implications of the case rippled throughout the county. The mayor announced the formation of a special commission to investigate housing discrimination, though critics quickly pointed out that the same mayor had ignored previous complaints and accepted campaign contributions from developers implicated in the Oakwood Heights scandal. Community organizations held town halls to discuss racial bias in housing, with many residents expressing shock at how such systematic discrimination could exist in their supposedly progressive area. "We like to think these things don't happen anymore," one longtime resident said during a particularly heated meeting. "But this case shows that racism doesn't always wear a hood or burn crosses. Sometimes it wears a polo shirt and carries a clipboard, hiding behind rules and regulations that are selectively enforced." For Amara and Marcus, the aftermath brought both vindication and new challenges. While their professional lives began to recover, they faced difficult decisions about their future in Oakwood Heights. Despite their legal victory, they had to consider whether staying in a community where they had experienced such hostility was worth the ongoing stress and potential safety concerns. As Amara sorted through the mountain of emails and messages that had accumulated, she paused at a notification of an invitation to speak at a national law enforcement conference on housing discrimination and civil rights enforcement. At the same moment, Marcus handed her a letter that had arrived in the mail, his expression grave. "Another threat?" she asked, taking the envelope carefully. He shook his head. "Death threats don't usually come on official FBI letterhead," he replied with a grim smile. "But this might be just as life-changing." Amara opened the letter to find an invitation to join a special federal task force on housing discrimination, utilizing her unique experience to help create new enforcement protocols nationwide. As she considered this potential new direction for her career, her phone rang with yet another call from a journalist seeking comment on what was now being called the Oakwood Heights conspiracy. The story was far from over, and the true test of whether lasting change would come from their ordeal was just beginning. 6 months after the dramatic arrests at the Oakwood Heights Community Center, Amara sat in the back row of a federal courtroom, watching as the judge delivered the verdicts in United States v. Whitfield et al. Charles Whitfield, Richard Tanner, Stephen Wells, and James Covington had all been found guilty on multiple charges including civil rights violations, conspiracy, impersonating law enforcement, and making criminal threats. The judge's voice was stern as she addressed the defendants. The evidence presented in this case reveals not merely isolated incidents of bias, but a calculated, years-long conspiracy to deny American citizens their constitutional right to live where they choose regardless of race. She stated for the record. This court views these actions as particularly egregious given the defendants' deliberate exploitation of symbols of authority to intimidate and harass their victims. Charles Whitfield received the harshest sentence. 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. His expression remained defiant even as he was led away in handcuffs, still apparently convinced of the righteousness of his actions. His co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 8 years, with additional financial penalties that would likely consume whatever assets they had accumulated. The civil proceedings against Victoria Stevenson and other HOA board members concluded with substantial settlements to former residents who had been driven from the community. While Victoria avoided criminal charges by cooperating with investigators, the financial penalties and public humiliation had led her to sell her home and move to another state. The case had triggered a cascade of legal reforms at both local and state levels. Amara had testified before a state legislative committee on housing discrimination, her personal experience lending powerful weight to her professional recommendations. The most insidious aspect of modern housing discrimination is its ability to hide behind seemingly neutral rules and regulations, she explained to the lawmakers. We need enforcement mechanisms that look beyond the surface to identify patterns of selective enforcement and coordinated harassment. Her testimony helped secure passage of new measures strengthening oversight of homeowners associations and establishing an independent review board for housing discrimination complaints. Locally, the ripple effects of the case continued to transform Oakwood Heights itself. The restrictive covenants and Byzantine rules that had been weaponized against minority residents were revised under court supervision, with clear limitations on enforcement powers and mandatory training on fair housing laws for all HOA board members. Marcus's architecture firm had not only recovered but thrived in the aftermath of the scandal. His innovative designs for inclusive community spaces had caught the attention of the County Development Board, leading to a contract to design a new community center focused on diversity and inclusion. The building would include exhibition space documenting the history of housing discrimination in the area, turning the painful episode into an educational opportunity for future generations. As Amara drove through the gates of Oakwood Heights after the final verdict, she noticed the subtle but significant changes that had transformed the neighborhood over the past months. New families of various backgrounds had moved in, taking advantage of properties sold by residents uncomfortable with the community's new direction. The Oakwood Heights security signs had been replaced with simple neighborhood watch notices emphasizing community cooperation rather than enforcement. Mrs. Abernathy, who had ultimately testified about her knowledge of Charles's activities despite her initial reluctance, had become an unexpected ally in the healing process. I stayed silent for years because I was afraid, she had admitted to Amara over tea. Not just of Charles and his friends, but of change itself. I'm too old to make that mistake again. The elderly woman now headed the Neighborhood Welcome Committee, personally delivering information packets to new residents with a genuine warmth that had been absent from the community for decades. At the Sheriff's Department, the investigation into Senior Deputy Frank Miller had revealed an extensive network of corrupt connections between law enforcement, developers, and local officials. Miller had been terminated and faced criminal charges, while several other deputies implicated in the scheme had resigned rather than face internal investigation. The department itself had undergone a thorough review of policies and practices, with Amara implementing new training protocols focused on recognizing and addressing bias in law enforcement response. The FBI had offered Amara a prestigious position leading a new initiative on housing discrimination, but after careful consideration, she had declined. My work here isn't finished, she explained to Marcus as they discussed the decision. The changes we've started need to be nurtured and protected. I can do more good continuing as sheriff than I could starting over at the federal level. Instead, she had established a cooperative program between her department and the FBI, serving as a consultant while maintaining her role as sheriff. Her experiences had made her a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences nationwide, where she shared the lessons learned from the Oakwood Heights case. The corrupt deputy and developers who had enabled Charles's regime had not escaped justice. Following the money trail uncovered during the investigation, federal prosecutors had built cases against 2 prominent development companies and several local officials who had systematically ignored complaints from minority residents. The resulting indictments had sent shockwaves through the business community, serving notice that housing discrimination would no longer be treated as a minor civil matter but as the serious criminal conspiracy it often represented. On a warm Saturday afternoon, 6 months to the day after the confrontation at the community center, Amara and Marcus hosted a neighborhood barbecue in their backyard. The gathering included both long-standing residents who had opposed Charles's methods and newcomers drawn to the community by its newfound commitment to inclusion. Children of various backgrounds played together on the lawn while adults engaged in conversations that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. As Amara served food to her guests, she spotted a young deputy from her department arriving with his family. Deputy Jamal Watson had recently purchased a home in another previously exclusionary neighborhood, inspired by Amara's stand against discrimination. "Sheriff Washington," he greeted her with a broad smile. "We just closed on the house yesterday. First black family on the block." Amara returned his smile, recognizing both the achievement and the challenge his statement represented. "How's the welcome been so far?" she asked, knowing all too well how surface cordiality could mask underlying resistance. "Mixed," he admitted. "But I've got your playbook now. Document everything, build relationships where possible, and never let them see you're affected by the small stuff." He looked around at the diverse gathering in what had once been the most exclusive neighborhood in the county. "Plus, you've shown it can be done. You didn't just fight back, you changed things." As the afternoon progressed into evening, Amara found a moment of quiet reflection on her back porch, watching the community she had helped transform. The struggle wasn't over, she knew. Discrimination had deep roots that wouldn't be eliminated by a single case or a few policy changes. There would be resistance, backlash, and new challenges ahead. But looking at Marcus laughing with neighbors who had once viewed them with suspicion, at children playing together without awareness of the barriers adults had tried to erect between them, at Deputy Watson discussing homeownership with a longtime resident who was offering genuine advice rather than veiled discouragement, she felt something she hadn't expected to find in Oakwood Heights: hope. The community wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward, each small interaction building towards something better than what had come before. As the sun set over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across lawns that had once been weaponized in the name of exclusion, Amara raised her glass in a private toast to justice, to resilience, and to the ongoing work of creating communities where everyone could truly belong. What would you do if you discovered discrimination in your community? Would you have the courage to stand up like Amara did, or would you stay silent like so many others initially did in Oakwood Heights? Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on fighting systemic discrimination. If this story of justice and transformation resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more powerful stories of everyday heroes standing up for what's right. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how discrimination can hide behind rules and regulations in our modern world. Thank you for joining me for this journey through Oakwood Heights, and remember, change begins when brave individuals refuse to accept injustice as the status quo. This story powerfully illustrates how racism often hides behind seemingly legitimate structures and rules. Discrimination doesn't always announce itself with obvious hate speech. It can operate through selective enforcement of regulations, manipulation of authority, and systemic intimidation. The most dangerous forms of prejudice are those disguised as maintaining standards or protecting property values. Amara's journey shows the importance of documentation and evidence gathering when confronting discrimination. Simple complaints can be dismissed, but patterns of behavior become undeniable when properly documented. The story also highlights how silence enables discrimination to flourish. Many residents knew what was happening but remained quiet out of fear or indifference, becoming complicit in the process. True change requires both individual courage and institutional reform. Amara's victory wasn't just about removing bad actors but transforming systems that allowed them to operate. The transformation of Oakwood Heights demonstrates that diverse communities don't diminish value, they enhance it through new perspectives and shared humanity. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that fighting discrimination isn't about revenge but restoration, creating spaces where everyone can truly belong, regardless of their race or background. Change begins when we refuse to accept injustice as normal, even when confronting it comes at personal cost. What form of hidden discrimination have you witnessed in your own community? Have you ever seen rules or regulations being applied differently depending on who was involved? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might help someone else recognize discrimination in their own neighborhood. If this account of systemic racism and one woman's brave stand against it moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories that expose injustice and celebrate those fighting for equality. Consider sharing this video with friends and family who might not recognize how discrimination can hide behind official-looking documents and community standards. Together, we can learn to identify and challenge racism in all its forms, even when it wears a polo shirt instead of a hood. Thank you for listening to Amara's powerful journey from targeted victim to agent of transformation. Remember, lasting change happens when brave individuals stand firm in the face of injustice and refuse to be driven away.